All right, welcome everyone to part 4 of our 5-part Talking About Israel series. Tonight's session, entitled War and Peace, will have a focus on the conflict of the region, looking at the numerous different wars, violent, non-violent protests, boycotts, and military operations. Tonight's speaker is Sam Tatarka, a highly active member of our community, having worked with countless organisations and serving as president of our very own Zionism Victoria. As always, none of this would be possible without the continual support of our supporters, so we thank them for their continued generosity. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to write them in the comments section in the live video, and we'll try and do our best to answer them. With that said, I'm going to hand it off to Sam for part 4 of our Talking About Israel series. Sam, take it away.
Thank you, Billy. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever in the world you might be. This is a novel experience in terms of doing a public address over computer, and I'm hoping that you will get something out of this talk and have an interesting session. If there are issues that arise in the course of the session, please feel free to let Joey know, and he will, of course, transmit that across to me. The technology is such that he and I are not in the same room, and therefore there's going to be some gaps in me understanding what you might be saying. So please bear with us as that happens. So tonight's topic is, or tonight's conversation is going to be about Israel's wars. They're not just Israel's wars, of course. It's a regional conflict that has gone on now for more than 70 years, and there have been several major wars and a number of something less than full-out wars, but nevertheless, each of those events have had a toll in both lives and quality of life for the people in Israel and their neighbours and the people who are impacted on by military action. So to go back to the beginning really is prior to the declaration of the state. Joey's going to put up on screen a PowerPoint presentation which will guide us through this conversation. Let's do that. Thank you, Joey. So that is obviously the iconic, absolutely iconic photo of. In fact, there are 5, although you tend only to see the front 3. There are 5 Sanhanim, Israeli paratroopers, who, having fought their way through the old city in the latter part of the 6-day war, arrived at the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, or the Kotel HaMa'aravi, which is the last remaining remnant of the temple. It's in fact a massive retaining wall that was built by Herod, and what you can see here is only a small section of a retaining wall that runs for several hundred metres along the western boundary of the temple now. For those of you who have had an opportunity to be in Israel, you can imagine what an iconic experience this would have been for these soldiers. And I can tell you, in 1967, when they got there, they were not standing in the plaza that you see there today. There was a number of Arab shops that had been set up just off the Kotel, and effectively that was just a narrow alleyway with the Western Wall on one side and shops on the other. So in any event, we'll go back before that. So let's go to 1947, after the declaration of the state. Next slide, please. Yeah. Thank you. So Israel achieved the endorsement of the United Nations in November 1947. In fact, the 29th of November 1947, for which streets are named in both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, as far as I'm aware, and most probably in other Israeli cities as well. Kaf Tet of November was the day of the UN partition vote. So Israel succeeded in persuading a sufficient number of United Nations representatives, among them Russia, and the United States, of course, and Australia, which was the first country to vote in favour of partition, to agree to a partition of the remnant part of the British Mandate of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. As I say, the motion was passed in November 1947, and independence was declared in May of 1948. In effect, the War of Independence began as soon as the Declaration of Independence came, because there were Arab militia already well entrenched within what is today Israel, who fought a number of actions against the Jewish settlement, the Yishuv, as it was known, in Israel, in an effort to kill the nascent state effectively before it was born. Unfortunately, the British decided to assist the Arabs in making life difficult for the Jews who remained in the Yishuv, and there was a lot of pressure on Ben Gurion and the leaders of the Yishuv to, in fact, not declare the state, even though they had won the endorsement of the United Nations. And the great fear was that Israel would be overrun immediately in 1948. So pre-state, we had the Haganah and the Irgun and other resistance groups. The Haganah is the forerunner of the Israeli Defense Forces that we have today. And the Haganah was already arming itself. It was making munitions, buying leftover World War II munitions in preparation for the war. There were a number of Jewish and non-Jewish soldiers who had fought in the Second World War, who assisted in training the nascent army of the State of Israel. But don't forget that many of the people who fought in that war were refugees from Europe, who only a few years earlier had come out of concentration camps and migrated to the State of Israel, or attempted to migrate to the State of Israel against the British blockade. So the War of 1948 was a very hard-fought war. It in fact went from May 1948 until well into 1949, and had a series of hot phases and cooler phases, but nevertheless a shooting war that went on for a considerable period of time. The result of the War of Independence was that the Jordanian forces took the old city of Jerusalem, and in fact all of East Jerusalem. The Jewish fighters retained the western part of the city. When the war came to an end, or I should say it didn't actually come to an end, it came to an armistice. There was no actual peace achieved at the end of the War of Independence. There was an armistice achieved. That armistice basically called for the parties to stop shooting at each other, which is what they did, having drawn on a map with a green texter a line that basically set out where they had put themselves to at the point of the armistice. So the green line, about which we will hear more further on in this lecture, is in fact a green line, a texter line on a map, which delineated the positions of the Jewish forces, the Israeli forces, and the opposing Arab forces as they laid down their arms, or at least stopped shooting at each other in early 1949. So the 1948 war involved Arab armies, and in fact we don't hear of the term Palestinian until almost 20 years or 15 years after the War of Independence. Israel's enemies at the time were both the indigenous Arab population, or some of the indigenous Arab population living in the borders of the new state, as well as the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. Iraq also had a hand in sending in troops, and it was those state armies that fought against the army of the State of Israel, which at that point became known as Haganah Israel, the army of the State of Israel. So it's important to remember that in 1947/48, in fact again in 1956 and again in 1967, what Israel was fighting against were state actors largely. There were in fact also Fedayeen, which were infiltrators or militants, not non-state actors involved, but essentially Israel was engaged in warfare with the Arab states that surrounded it, all of whom point blank refused to achieve a peace with Israel that was on the table really from the very beginning. Okay, have the next slide, please. Thank you. You'll see this map, and you'll see where the armies came from. So the Egyptians came up from the south, the Jordanians attacked from the east. The Lebanese came in from the north, and the Syrians came in from the northeast. It was a very, very concerted attack, and had every prospect of destroying the nation state because of the might of the armies, which were all standing armies at the time. The Arab Legion, you will see, numbering some 5,000 men, also were involved in the war. And by the time the war was over, Israel was reduced to a very narrow strip of land, particularly at its waist. So it controlled the Mediterranean coast. It controlled the eastern half of Jerusalem, some parts of the Negev, and some parts of the north. But in every respect, for example, the Golan Heights, the Syrians continued to control, and that remained the state of affairs until 1967. So, as the narration says, the state at the time was a sliver along the coast. It settled the centre, and those countries, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, and Lebanon, invaded Israel with the goal of eliminating the newly created state. And the Arab League promised the Palestinians they will be able to return to their homes once the war was over. Now, historians debate the accuracy of this proposition. So I'm not putting it up as the, historians debate the proposition of whether or not the Palestinian or the Arab population of Israel willingly evacuated because they were being told by their leaders in other countries that if they did, they would make way for the victorious Arab armies to enable them to throw the Jews into the sea, and they would return victoriously to their homes. It's an undoubted fact that about 700,000 Arabs who previously lived in what is today Israel left the country at the time. It's probably true, in fact it is true, that the Israeli forces required some villages to be evacuated and destroyed some Arab villages because the nature of the Arab of not occupation, but the nature of the way in which Arabs lived there were villages dotted throughout the country, and some of those villages held very, very strategic positions, particularly positions on the road to Jerusalem, so that they were able to effectively blockade the road to Jerusalem. Anybody who's driven up to Jerusalem will know today from the road there are various choke points where there are high vantage points in which the villagers sat. They were able to shoot and pick off the Israelis who were trying to get up to Jerusalem to reinforce it. And in fact, some of the wreckage of the trucks they were using remain rusting by the roadside as a reminder of the effort that went into defending the state when it was first declared. Next slide, please. Thank you. So 1949, we spoke about the green line. You will see effectively that the green area is where the armistice line was drawn. So Israel had been reduced to quite a narrow waist at near Tatarka. Jordan ended up controlling the West Bank. Egypt had Gaza in its control, and it was at the southern border. There was a narrow demilitarized zone around the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, which was controlled by Syria. Syria dominated the heights above the Jordan Valley, and in fact, for the next several years, the Syrians used that position of advantage to bomb kibbutzim in the Jordan Valley. You'll see also that there are some very significant Arab towns very close to Jewish positions. Jenin is close to Hadera, Nazareth is close to Haifa, Acre itself was quite a heavily Arab populated city, and so that's the state of affairs as at the 1949 Green Line ceasefire. Next slide, please. Okay, so things were quiet for about 6 or 7 years until the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which was previously owned by Britain and France. Now, the Suez Crisis of 1956 was not just a war of Israel against Egypt. The French and the British were engaged in the war as well, because the French and the British had very serious economic interests in the Suez Canal, which provides a vital link in shipping between the Mediterranean Sea and their ports. So the Suez was of crucial strategic significance. It played a prominent part in 1956 and again a role in 1967. So to some extent, some would argue that Israel was the proxy of the British and the French when they invaded the Sinai Desert to control the Suez Canal. The British and the French supported the war because they wanted Nasser not to be able to block the channel. The US and the USSR, Russia and the United States declared a ceasefire and ordered the British and French forces to withdraw. And a UN peacekeeping force came into the area in 1956 and remained there until 1967. Significantly, in the course of the 1956 war, Israel and the Brits and the French took control then of the Sinai Peninsula, but then they withdrew back to their lines at the end of that war. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. What's difficult for me is I can't see you and understand whether you've got any questions. If there are any particular questions, please feel free to send them in, and we'll be more than happy to deal with them later. Okay, so now to understand what's going on in the Arab countries between 1948 and 1967, you've had these very largely populated Arab countries deeply humiliated by having promised to kick the Jews out of the country in 1948 and not winning. They didn't do well. And you'll also notice from the cartoons that are part of this slide that this is not a war of competing states. Rampant anti-Semitism underwrote what was being spoken about. It was not talked about a war between the Arabs and the Israelis. It was talked about the Arabs and the Jews. It was a religious war as well as a political war. And in 1967, there was an increasing temperature from President Nasser, who by that time was trying to unite all of the Arab countries again under his leadership, a greater Arab empire, if you like, and to have yet another attempt at knocking Israel off. Now, if you think about it, this is a country now that has suffered three major wars in the space of its first 19 years of life. And very few countries have had to deal with that level of aggression throughout its early history. Now, there are some that argue that the 1967 war was a war of aggression by Israel. And therefore, that leads into the whole question of the occupation of territory as a result of that war. The Israeli position is, and one that I completely endorse, is that the 1967 war, as was the case with the 1973 war and the 1956 Suez crisis and the 1948 war, were all defensive wars in which Israel was fighting for its very life, and therefore any territory that it gained in the course of the defensive war does not fall under the aegis of occupied territory, as people would have you believe. That's just not the fact. In any event, in 1967, on June the 5th, there were the Egyptian Air Force, which was actually superior in numbers and arguably superior in aircraft to the Israeli Air Force at the time, were gathering. There was lots of saber rattling in Egypt. Nasser was making stirring speeches to the masses, again riling them up for having a go at defeating Israel, and therefore the temperature was rising and rising and rising. Israel preemptively struck on the 5th of June 1967 and basically out the Egyptian Air Force whilst it was on the ground. If the Egyptian Air Force had been enabled or had been allowed to play an active part in the war, the outcome of the 1967 war may have been quite different. The real getting the Egyptian Air Force grounded was a very important strategic event. It occurred on the first day of the war and was perhaps one of the most significant reasons that the war took the very short period of time that it did. It's also important to note this, and I think this gets a bit lost in all the storytelling of the 1967 war. Israel knew it was in trouble, and it was facing the Syrians in the north, who they couldn't speak to at all. It was facing the Egyptians from the south, and for the reasons I've described, there was no real opportunity to have a conversation with the Egyptians to try and reduce the temperature. But where Israel did seriously try to reduce temperature was with the Jordanians. And in fact, messages were sent to the Jordanians urging them not to involve themselves in the war and promising them that if Jordan did not join with Egypt and Syria in attacking Israel, Israel would not attack Jordan. As you saw on the map on the previous slide, the significance of that was the west bank of the Jordan River, perceived from the Jordanian side, not the Israeli side. The west bank of the Jordan River was Israel's narrowest point and also involved Jerusalem. So if you appreciate how significant Jerusalem is to Israel generally and to Jews the world over, you will understand what a concession it was that Israel was prepared to say to Jordan, if you stay out of the war, we will not attack you. Now, Nasser persuaded the king of Jordan that he was doing very well in the war and got him to actually attack Israel, I think on the 6th or the 7th of June, 2 days into the war. Jordan got in, even though it had been told repeatedly that if it stayed out, its territory would not be threatened. As a result of that decision by Jordan, Israel joined battle with Jordan, as well as the other two countries. There was some incredible tank battles, bigger than the tank battles of the Second World War in the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel emerged from that six-day war, as the slide says, with an outright victory. It flattened the Egyptian Air Force, took significant tolls on the Syrian Air Force, and from a territorial point of view, took over the whole of what is today referred to as the West Bank, but is really the East Bank of Israel, but from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, which it had not previously controlled, and it took over the Sinai Desert completely and took over the Golan Heights from Syria. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, as I said, the Six-Day War was a battle fought on all fronts. The Egyptian campaign was over very early. The Syrian campaign was an uphill battle, and remember, folks, that the weapons available, the weapon systems available at that time were not the same. The strategic advantage that the Syrians had by holding the high ground was very significant. Israeli soldiers were able to fight their way up the Golan Heights and basically push the Syrians back away from the Golan Heights. So Israel ended up controlling the Golan Heights. You can see the photos of the Zion Gate, which is, I'm pretty sure that's the Zion Gate being shown, and the pock marks of bullet holes. If you visit Jerusalem today, those bullet holes remain, as do a number of bullet holes on the western side of the city, opposite the old city, which were fired by Jordanian legionnaires from the walls of the old city, taking pot shots at the Israelis going about their daily lives in the western part of the city. So as you approach the old city, if you turn around instead of looking straight at the old city, you will see a number of spots where buildings in Jerusalem still bear the hallmarks of the Jordanian occupation of the old city. From the point of view of religious freedom, and a lot is said about religious freedom in relation to Jerusalem, the fact is that between 1948 and 1967, Jews were absolutely banned from going into the old city. So the Western Wall was blocked, couldn't get permission to go to the old city at all. And in fact, in the wake of the 1948 victory by the Jordanian forces, they essentially bulldozed and blew up the Jewish quarter, which had survived inside the old city for centuries, in fact. again, I may be talking to people who know this very well, but I don't know. There may be people who don't know it very well. When you talk about the Jewish quarter of the Old City, it's not actually a quarter of the Old City. It's an area in the Old City that was primarily Jewish. In fact, Jews lived throughout the Old City, including what's known as the Muslim quarter today, the Armenian quarter, and the Christian quarter. So people lived all over the city, although they were concentrated, the Jews were concentrated in the Jewish quarter. The Muslim quarter, which takes up about 2/3 of the Old City, was the majority of the population. The Armenian quarter, which is about half the size of the Jewish quarter, was also lived in by Armenians, lots of refugees from the Turkish genocide at the turn of the century, and the Christian quarter had been there for centuries because of the Christian belief in the holiness of Jerusalem from the perspective of their religious beliefs and the paths that Jesus walked 2,000 years ago. Next slide. Okay, so now between 1967 and 1973, there were a couple of notable events. It's important for you all to know that in 1967, at the end of the Six-Day War, Israel indicated to the Arab countries that they were prepared to hand back the territory, including coming to an agreement about Jerusalem itself. They were prepared to hand back the territory that had been conquered in the course of the Six-Day War on the basis of a peace agreement. Israel has persistently tried to offer land for peace and persistently has been accused in those efforts. The famous Khartoum conference in which the Arabs declared no 3 times, no negotiations, no peace. There was nothing that was going to allow the Arabs to coexist with Israel back in 1967. And remember that the Six-Day War was a absolutely humiliating defeat for the Arab countries, Nasser in particular, Sadat, who's shown in this photo in his military uniform, who later became a terribly important figure in Israel-Egyptian relations, became the president of Egypt, and the Syrians in particular and the Egyptians started to get ready to reconquer the territory that they'd lost in 1967. At this point, there's a shift in world alliances. In the 1967 war, Israel was flying mostly French-made aircraft. The Arabs were flying mostly equipment provided by the Russians. And by the time the Six-Day War comes along, the French had stopped supplying Israel with arms. By the time the Yom Kippur War comes along, the French had stopped supplying arms to Israel. America became Israel's principal arms supplier. And in fact, it was only due to the United States that Israel was able to continue the Yom Kippur War because their own stockpiles of weapons and materiel were used up. And in fact, President Nixon, I think it was responsible for resupplying Israel in the course of that war so it could continue to fight. The losses and the casualties on the Israeli side of the war were huge. They didn't have the men or the material or the weapons to be able to continue to fight without being resupplied. One of the great criticisms of the Israeli government in 1973, led by Golda Meir at the time, was that they ignored the warning signs of the Arab build-up. Israel was aware that there was an Arab build-up happening. There's no question from a review of Israeli intelligence information that they were aware that it was happening, but the consensus was that an attack would not occur. By the time we get to 1973, Israel had built a very significant fortification along the Sinai called the Bar-Lev line. For those of you who are students of history, you'd be aware of the Maginot line and other attempts to fortify borders to keep enemies out. Historically, they've never done very well. If the enemy is sufficiently motivated, they will overtake and overrun hardened positions, and that's precisely what happened in the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur, as everybody knows, I assume, it's the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The vast majority of the Israeli army was on stand down during the Yom Kippur War, during Yom Kippur itself, and the country was mobilized very rapidly as a result of a surprise attack which began on the morning of Yom Kippur. There are iconic photos and videos of Israelis pouring out of the shul with their shawls on, jumping into jeeps and going straight to the front to fight. It truly was, in those early days of the Yom Kippur War, a fight for survival because the Arab armies made very significant inroads in the first few days of the war. Next slide, please. Okay, so Israel was interested in, at this point, was mainly dealing with terrorists. The Munich Olympics had occurred in 1972, and there'd been a terrorist attack in Munich, which resulted from Germany's handling the death of a number of Israeli athletes. Israel had been warned off by the Americans not to launch any preemptive strikes. So again, the US held the first strings, if you like, or the weapons that Israel needed. So Israel was very much beholden to the United States. And Golda, you'll see what Golda Meir is quoted as saying. After the war, she said, 1973 is not 1967. This time we will not be forgiven. We will not receive assistance when we have the need for it if we launch a preemptive attack. So the Israelis made a conscious decision to await being attacked, if that was what was going to happen, rather than to launch a preemptive strike as they had so successfully done in 1967. Next slide, please. Okay, so on the 6th of October 1973, which I assume is on Yom Kippur, Syrians and the Egyptians attacked in unison. And they caught the Israelis completely off guard. The Syrian advance across the Golan Heights was massive. You can see 30,000 men and 800 tanks. They came straight over the top and were threatening the Jordan Valley. The Egyptians had 100,000 men and 800 tanks across the Sinai border, pushing through the Bar-Lev line. Just as a note of Australian history, there was an Australian, in fact, a graduate of Yeshiva College who had joined the Israeli army and who was on duty on the Bar-Lev line on the Yom Kippur War, Marvin Fakula, and unfortunately he lost his life in that first push of the Egyptians across the Bar-Lev line. That you'll see that the Israelis were able to withhold in the Valley of Tears a massive Syrian tank battle. Until today, that tank battle is studied in military colleges worldwide because nobody understands how it was that the Israelis were able to keep the Syrians at bay, given the overwhelming force of arms that the Syrians had massed, and they just stopped coming. The advance stopped for reasons that nobody really understands, but they stopped. And the Egyptians, instead of continuing to push forward across the Sinai, they took up defensive positions, which allowed the Israelis to push back. In fact, if both the Syrians and the Egyptians had pressed their attack in the early days of the war, it's highly likely that Israel would not have survived the push. It took time to get men assembled, it took time to get people to the front, it took time to move weapons to the front, and it took time as time went on to resupply the army. And that was really a crucial exercise. The Americans were supplying Israel by airlift out of their European base. That's how the weapons came in. Next slide, please. Okay. So the Kuwaitis, the Saudi Arabians, the Jordanians, and the Omanis all decided they'd have a go as well. Again, emphasising the fact that this is not an exercise in which you are seeing non-state actors involved. That changes very significantly after the Yom Kippur War, but you're still basically state actors versus state actors. The northern border was secured first, so the Golan Heights were retaken. The Syrians were pushed back within 20 kilometres of Damascus when the Americans called a halt. And then Israel was able to concentrate on pushing the Egyptians back out of Sinai, and that was a brilliant tank battle led by the late Arik Sharon, who was a tank commander of legendary ability, a very bold move, very bold move by him, essentially surrounded the Egyptian Third Army in the Sinai Desert and took many, many tens of thousands of Egyptians prisoner. The look of amusement and defeat on the face of the Egyptian soldiers as they are being taken captive, given that they had such stunning victories in the early parts of the war, was really quite extraordinary. And you'll see by the 17th of October, the Egyptian troops were surrounded. That was the start of the oil embargo. The Soviets threatened to enter Egypt and all hostilities ended. Now, what you'll appreciate here is that some of the Cold War is in fact playing itself out in the Middle East. You've got the Americans testing weapons and supplying weapons to the Israelis. You've got the Arabs being supplied by the Soviets. And so some of these air battles and tank battles and missile battles were in fact ways in which the Americans and the Russians could test their respective weapons in combat to see who had superiority. Thankfully for us, the combination of Israeli tenacity, American ingenuity with Israeli modifications meant that the Israelis had the superiority of arms, but it was a close fought war. Next slide. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, Israel was completely shell-shocked. To appreciate the psyche of Israel in 1973, you really need to understand that in 1967, Israel was victorious in 6 days with very few casualties and visited a massive defeat on the Arab armies. In 1973, there were 3,000 soldiers killed. In Israeli terms, that is an enormous number per capita of Israeli troops who were captured. It was a huge, humiliating and psychological defeat for the Israelis. For those who have got an interest in some real ephemera, at the end of the Six-Day War, the Israelis were talking. Those of you who are familiar with the prayer of Hallel will know that there's a line in Hallel about Israel b'tach Hashem. Israel believes in God. Israel's faith is in God, and it is through God that we achieve victory. In the aftermath of the 67 war, the conversation was Israel b'tach Tzahal, that is, Israel believes in the army. By the time 1973 came around, the miracles that saw Israel actually survive that war turned that phrase back to where many believed it belonged. That Israel relied on God in order to survive, not just on the army. Although, of course, without the army, we would have nothing to say. The Egyptians suffered very heavy casualties: 20,000 dead, 10,000 captured. They nevertheless saw it as a victory because they had inflicted such pain on the Israelis. But shortly after that, Jimmy Carter, who persists to this day, interestingly enough, was able to bring Sadat and Begin together in order to make a peace between Egypt and Israel, which has persisted until this day. So, cold peace though it may be, a peace it is. Egypt and Israel have not had a shooting war in over 50 years, thank God, or nearly 50 years, and we can be very proud of the fact that peace was achieved. And Begin was the most unlikely of peacemakers, one would say, and so truly was Sadat. They both stepped out of their comfort zone to create a situation which resonates until today. Next slide, please. Right, post Camp David, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt in exchange for peace, land for peace. The negotiations culminated in Sadat coming to Israel. There is a fantastic photograph of the Egyptian government plane on the ground at Ben Gurion. However, Sadat was assassinated 2 years later by Muslim extremists who believed that he should never have made peace with the Israeli enemy, but nevertheless, that peace survived his death and survived until this day. Next slide, please. Okay, the focus now really shifts from state to state conflict to state to non-state actor conflict. And the first example of that was in 1982, which was the first war in Lebanon, known as Peace for Galilee, Shalom al-Gallille. The reason it was called that is because Israel was being shelled by the PLO, as they were then known, led by Yasser Arafat, who took over Lebanon. Basically, they'd been kicked out of Jordan, they'd been kicked out of Tunis. They find themselves in Lebanon. They are doing to Lebanon in 1982 that which they continue to do, or that which Hezbollah continues to do today in Lebanon, which is basically have a government within a government. And you'll see that in 1982, the Israeli ambassador to England was shot by PLO terrorists, and 2 days later, the Israeli forces moved into Lebanon, and the point of the exercise was to push the PLO out of Lebanon. I'm sorry, they went from Lebanon to Tunis. They didn't come from Tunis to Lebanon. The war became a much bigger conflict than Israel had anticipated. The Syrians got involved. Arafat was able to ultimately evacuate under essentially terms negotiated by the United States and the Soviet Union, which saw the PLO withdraw from Lebanon and off to Tunis. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the PLO left, but Hezbollah moves in. And starting in July of 2006, Hezbollah is starting in July 2006. Hezbollah is regularly firing rockets across and into Israel. The actual trigger for the war in 2006 was an operation by Hezbollah terrorists who crossed the border into Israel and took, well, they actually killed the two soldiers. It's not likely that they lived beyond their capture. They captured two Israeli soldiers, Ehud Goldwasser and Eldad Regev, and in the process of that capture, the Israelis attacked over the border in order to try and retrieve those two soldiers, and then a war that lasted 34 days commenced, and a land invasion, and you can see photos of Israeli troops in Lebanon. Many Lebanese were killed as a result of that. There were 1,300 Lebanese killed, apart from the Hezbollah fighters. 165 Israelis were killed as a result of rocket fire to Israel, 2,700 wounded, and 1 million Israelis were displaced. Those of you who are old enough to remember this will remember the pictures of Israelis being taken to the south for respite because the north was under siege all the time. People were having to stay in shelters. In fact, there are hospitals today in the north that are completely underground in anticipation of a further war that might break out that would result in significant above-ground damage. So the Israelis are ready for that eventuality and have taken steps to prepare themselves for. Next slide, please. 2006. So again, in 2006, Ariel Sharon, who again you would think would be the most unlikely of peacemakers, Sharon was held accountable and responsible for the deaths in the Shatila and Sabra refugee camps in Lebanon in the course of the 1982 war. But nevertheless, Sharon made the decision that he was going to evacuate all Israelis out of Gaza and essentially hand Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority to do with it as they wanted. Thousands of Israeli families left their homes, some voluntarily, some by force. It's fair to say that the decision to evacuate Gaza with nothing in return caused a major rift in Israeli society, both politically and emotionally. There was huge emotional toll from the evacuation. Nothing good came of that evacuation, I'm sorry to say. And in fact, it sowed the seeds for a couple of wars that have occurred since, because the Palestinians who lived in Gaza, in their wisdom or stupidity, decided to elect Hamas, a terrorist organisation, to be their government in Gaza, and that has led to a string of conflicts to go on until this day. Next slide, please. Okay, in 2006, Gilad Shalit was kidnapped through a terror tunnel burrowed underneath the border from Gaza. Israel retaliated in the same way, in many ways mirroring what happened in 1982. Israel attacked Gaza in force in an effort to retrieve Shalit and to put an end to the rocket fire. Shalit was not retrieved. He was in fact held captive for a number of years later, and he ultimately was released. I believe he's leading a full life now in Israel, and we were lucky enough to hear from him after his release when he attended in Australia as a guest of the UIA as part of their annual appeal some years ago. Quite a remarkable young man, thrust into the limelight. Never, ever imagined in his wildest dreams that his life would lead him where it did. Even though there was a ceasefire in 2006, Shalit remained a prisoner for a number of years. The rockets didn't stop coming. They come in greater or lesser degrees. Rockets are still coming today, as are incendiary devices floated over in balloons, as are terror tunnels being dug deeper to achieve the same end. So we still haven't seen a resolution of the Gaza conflict, but that was summer rain in 2006. Next slide, please. Cast lead in 2008. That began with the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teenagers or young men. Again, Hamas upped its rocket fire. It has built terror tunnels and taken the opportunity to take aid that has been given to them, concrete that has been given to them to build power stations and water and storage and all the things that you would need for civil society were misused to create weapons and bunkers. And ultimately, Israel was involved in another ground invasion beginning on the 3rd of January that lasted 2 weeks, again until Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire, and estimated 1,500 Palestinians died, of which the majority were Hamas operatives, not civilians, but nevertheless, it's unarguable that a number of Palestinian civilians living in Gaza were the unfortunate victims of their own government's stupidity in continuing to fight with Israel rather than looking for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Next slide, please. 2014. There's a ring of familiarity with all this. So 4 rocket attacks, kidnapping and murder of Israeli teenagers, 17th July 2014. Israel's involved in Protective Edge. 50 days of conflict this time. Huge damage in Gaza, tremendous damage. Notwithstanding the photos that you see, the damage was as localized as it could possibly be in a heavily populated area. But Hamas, as a deliberate tactic, and I mean, nobody can fail to be moved by the photos of people carrying tiny babies to their burial. It is horrendous beyond words to talk about the loss of innocent lives. And there is no way in which one says that sort of thing is a palatable outcome of a war, but nevertheless, that is the consequences of Hamas making deliberate decisions to embed their military positions within civilian, highly populated civilian areas. You'll see that what the IDF accomplished in Gaza as part of that war. 32 terror tunnels were demolished. 80% or 70% of Hamas's rocket arsenal was destroyed, and over 1,000 terrorists were killed. But amongst that toll, there were a significant number of Palestinian civilians killed, caught in the crossfire, or used deliberately. But when faced with the sort of position that Israel was, it really had little choice but to take action to put an end to the rocket fire. Okay. The big question. And there's a reason why that piece of paper is blank. Who knows? if I was to venture a personal opinion, I would say most unlikely that peace is on the horizon, notwithstanding the Trump peace plan. If Trump is re-elected in November this year, maybe there's some traction in his peace plan. There's no denying that Trump is an avid supporter of Israel, but he's so mercurial, I wouldn't bet on his ongoing support being a reality. You really don't know. The plan is very ill-defined. It seems to be essentially, from our perspective, a very pro-Israeli solution. I don't expect that the Palestinians will accept it. The question really is whether or not they end up with a choice. When I gave this talk last year, my position was that peace was so remotely on the horizon you couldn't see it if you were 1,000 feet in the air. I don't think my view has changed significantly since then. What really is needed, in my view, is a continuing, really generational change and a significant change in attitude by Palestinians and some Israelis to accept each other for the people that they are. My experience of spending a lot of time in Israel has been that the vast majority of Palestinians in the street want nothing better than what we want, which is good lives for themselves and their families and a better life for their children than they have themselves. Unfortunately, the political and military leadership that dominates Palestinian society is missing every single opportunity they have to build relations with Israel, to build relationships between Palestinians and Israelis that could ultimately lead to a peaceful coexistence. And until such time as there is a significant shift in that attitude, in my view, you're unlikely to see a sustained peaceful coexistence between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I think that probably left us with 10 minutes or so questions. So, Joey, welcome back, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So we're going to jump into questions. I've got quite a few questions here. One question from Facebook was why the choice to start with 1947? There is, a lot of conflict that happened even before then with the British as well. Could you maybe discuss that a tiny bit?
Sure. The idea of establishing a state, a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, in British mandated Palestine, was an idea that predated the First World War. I started in 1947 because that's really the history of Israel's wars rather than conflict between Arabs and Jews. It's undoubtedly true that part of the seeds of the conflict, apart from what might describe as Arab anti-Semitism, the seeds of the conflict were laid in the aftermath of the First World War and the British and French ineptitude in divvying up the Turkish Ottoman Empire into a series of countries that in some senses make absolutely no sense at all. And we continue to see that play itself out in Iraq, where the Kurds have got no interest in being Iraqis, but they are because the British and the French said they would. So, yes, the seeds go back earlier. There were certainly Arab riots against Jews, most famously in the 1920s in Hebron, in which a significant number of Jews were killed. But hostilities between Arabs and their Jewish neighbours go back well before 1947.
So moving on, I guess something that's very clear from your presentation is that war and the concept of war is more or less woven throughout the very foundation of Israel itself. So I guess a question from that is, what kind of impact does that have on the establishment, on the continuance of a state? What does it do to the economy? What does it do to society? That constant concept of war being almost, each decade there being something new.
Really interesting question. I think the Israeli psyche is all about live your life the best life you possibly can under circumstances that are least desirable. Nobody I've ever met in Israel wants war. War or being prepared to defend oneself is the key, I think, to Israel's psyche. And speaking as a Jew who's looked at Jewish history over the past 2 or 3 millennia, having an Israeli army, having the capacity to defend Jews is a unique perspective. We haven't seen that in thousands of years in terms of Israel or Jews in a position to defend themselves if the need arises. I still think that it's unarguable that Israel would make significant concessions for peace if peace could be assured. And the real question, the real overriding question is whether there is any real assurance of peace if a treaty or piece of paper is signed and significant territory handed over to the control of the Palestinians. If Gaza represents a scientific experiment in what might be in somewhat of an independent, a semi-independent Palestinian state, it doesn't border well. I think notwithstanding that, Israel has excelled in so many areas: science, medicine, water, agriculture, land use, life. I mean, you can't not be in Israel and be enthused by the way in which Israelis live their life. Being prepared for conflict is just a necessary part of that life, an unfortunate part of their life, but one that they accept as the price that one has to pay to have the kind of life that they have, and to have, for the first time in thousands of years, a state that the Jews can call home, which I'm tremendously proud of.
Yep, great answer. So I guess moving on, what kind of changes do you think the shift from conflict between traditional states to non-state actors has created for the way the world and the way, you know, people who aren't Zionists see Israel?
I think that, again, being of an age, in 1967 and 1973, Israel was the David being attacked by the Goliath. So really up until 1973, Israel was the weaker actor, and to the extent that people barracked for the underdog, people generally barracked for Israel in these conflicts because it was the victim of attack or at least hostility by known state actors. That narrative has significantly shifted in the last 50 years or so. The narrative is now about Israel the oppressor, Israel the occupier, and Israel struggles to make its point, its advocacy point on a regular basis, but in fact, it's not looking for hostility, it's not looking for wanting to be in control of other people. It's there because it has to be, not because it wants to be. But I think there's an undoubted impact on Israel's place in the world. On the other hand, I should say, there are dynamic or tectonic shifts within the Arab world nowadays that is having a significant impact on the way in which Israel is now being portrayed to the Arab world, or certainly parts of the Arab world. The Saudis in particular are on a path of rapprochement, as are a number of the Gulf states with Israel, and therefore the sort of stuff that's playing on state television in those countries is shifting from a demonization of Israel and the Jews to a potentially grudging admiration of some of the good things they do. Israel has been at the forefront of COVID research. If the Israelis were to make a breakthrough in COVID, and let's hope that they do, but it doesn't matter who wins the race, as long as somebody wins the race sooner rather than later, it would be a huge feather in the cap of Israeli scientists. But I'm even hearing last night on the ABC News how they are looking at Israel's flattening of the curve as an example that Australia can look to, and the experience of lifting restrictions and how you still maintain populations being able to go about their business even though there are outbreaks. So then you hear on the ABC Israel being spoken about positively, and it's not the first time last night, is a tremendously good thing to see. So I think that's shifting.
So I think we've got time for one more because we're about to tick over to 9 o'clock. So I guess peace was obviously the final.
I'm happy to stay a bit longer, Joe.
All right. Yeah, that's right. So then I'll ask another one. So a lot of people look at what happened in 1967 with a preemptive strike against the Egyptian Air Force, what you mentioned in your presentation. A lot of people see that as a potentially unnecessary or provocative approach by Israel. You mentioned it briefly about the fact that Israel was kind of surrounded by a lot of threat and a lot of worry from Syria, from Egypt. Could you maybe delve a little deeper into that and just explain like how dangerous was it at that time?
So Nasser's political philosophy was about pan-Arabism. He wanted to be effectively the emperor of all of the Arab countries, and it was all about uniting the Arab countries under Egyptian leadership. And in the context of the failure in 1947 and 1956 to achieve their aims of pushing the Jews into the sea, by 1967 he had rearmed, significantly. He had the Soviets rearming him. There is absolutely no question on the examination of historical documents that if Israel had, forget about what Israel did, Egypt was about to attack. There is just no question at all. So talk about it in terms of it being a provocation. If Israel had sat back and done nothing, the Egyptian Air Force would have taken to the sky and done significant damage to Israel and its population centres, as well as to its army. Israel's response was, Israel's preemptive strike was a piece of military genius, not an act of provocation.
Oh yeah. So finishing, I guess the last slide of your presentation was obviously about peace and the prospect of peace. So I guess the question is as simply as you can, what do you think are the three principles by which peace may be achieved going forward?
To my mind, the absolute core of it is mutual respect.
Yep.
And in this, I don't believe Israel politically or socially an overwhelming number of an overwhelming plurality support the idea of peaceful coexistence if that can be achieved. Where you tend to see divisions in Israeli society is whether or not it can be achieved. So you've got the doubters who say there's just no point to this, and you've got those who say yes, we should continue to try and make it happen. But the first step in my view is respect, and that's building respect from the ground up. So it's the micro relationships between Israelis and Arabs, or Jews and Muslims, if you like, that will guide the greater capacity for dialogue, the more that one sees of the other as not being some other that you can't relate to, but rather being a human being who you can relate to, the more likely it is that peace will be enabled. The next thing in my mind is essentially the narrative, the Palestinian narrative, has to change. And there are a couple of key elements of that have to change. The Palestinian right of return is never going to happen. And until there is some, other than perhaps in some symbolic way, as was discussed in the Camp David Accords, where you'd allow a certain, some of the people who were displaced in 1948 continue to live. I don't see any problem at all with bringing, those elderly people back to Israel in a symbolic way to say, well, they have returned back to their homeland that they left. Whether they left or they were rejected, that's not as relevant as the symbolism of allowing that to happen. But the idea of a mass Palestinian right of return along, parallels the Jews' right of return to Israel, is never going to happen. And until you get a Palestinian leader who is prepared to tell his people that this idea of taking back Israel from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, is garbage. And until that piece of garbage is put in the bin, the prospects of peace, in my mind, remain remarkably remote. And that leads me to the third point, which is really generational change. I think that you need to see the more education that you see in Palestinian society, the more engagement, the more worldly Palestinian society is able to become. The internet is certainly a driver for things like that, where people are able to see what life is like on the other side. You're not just reading what's in the papers. You who've got capacity to see what's happening, not happening on the other side of the border. If a Palestinian leader like Sadat, really, if you want a Palestinian Sadat who is willing to take a bold move, tell his people the reality of what's going to happen, and then make a deal, I think that's where the prospect of peace is. Do I think that that's viable in the current Palestinian leadership? No. There may be 20 and 30-year-old Palestinians who in their future will be able to become that Palestinian Sadat, but until such time as such a person emerges, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And just to round that out, for those, for the Bibi haters, and it's all Bibi's fault, and Bibi doesn't do it, blah, 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 blah. I'd just like to finish by saying this. Each peace deal that Israel has made, each significant peace deal that Israel has made, has largely been from the right-wing side of politics, who you would never expect to take the step. Begin with Sadat, Sharon with the Gaza experiment, and do I think Bibi would make peace if peace was really on the table, if you believe it would actually bring a cooperative and unified sense of lasting peace? I think even those who are Bibi's greatest detractors would have to concede that he's big enough to want, if nothing else, for his own ego, to be the man who brought peace to the Middle East. But I think that the Israeli leadership, the Israeli political leadership, and the Israeli will is to make peace if peace is possible.
Yep, amazing. I think that's a great place to finish. So with that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to share your knowledge and give us the amazing presentation that you did. And as always, thank our supporters for their continued generosity. So this was part 4 of a 5-part Talking About Israel series. We'll be back next week for the final part, which is going to be about media action. It's going to look at...
Just before we sign off, can I tell our audience about a very special show that airs on J-Air?
Absolutely.
The Jewish radio station, Jewish community radio station. David Schulberg has been running a program called the Israel Connection, spelled with an X, CONNEXION, has been talking about Israel for the last 5 years. David brings people on air from all over Israel and discusses his point of view or discusses all sorts of topics in relation to Israel in an effort to connect people in Australia with Israel. He's produced over 200 programs and he's hosted a large number of people with very diverse views on a large number of subjects. David's looking to extend his coverage into the Zoom world in which we now inhabit and sees the opportunity for that to occur. His program is on every week from Wednesday to 4 to 5 p.m, repeated on Fridays from 1 to 2 on J-Air, which is 87.8 FM, which narrowcasts, not broadcasts, narrowcasts in the Caulfield area, but is also available online. This week he's going to be speaking with Martin Sherman, CEO of the Israeli Institute of Strategic Studies, who will be making the case for annexation by Israel of parts of Judea and Samaria. So I'm sure that will be a very interesting discussion. There'll be another guest on his show soon who opposes annexation, and hence the discussion, the exchange of ideas, the vigorous debate of ideas that is so necessary to informing ourselves continues. You can visit the Israel Connection Program Facebook page, which offers go-to information about the program every week, an opportunity to provide feedback, and it's also available on podcast. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. So next week is obviously going to be our last Talking About Israel workshop. It's going to be called Media Action. It's going to be a focus on the way the media portrays what's happening in Israel, the history of the conflict there, and also what kind of steps we can take to better our understanding of the media and also use the media to our advantage when talking and discussing Israel. So thank you once again, Sam, for taking the time tonight, and thank you for everyone that tuned in, and looking forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you, and thank you all for tuning in.